Okay, so your first question will most likely be something that's really, really easy. All they've asked you to do is read through figure 1. I would have spent probably a couple of minutes doing that. You just need to have a look at the map. And it asks you to do something really simple. You need to read through the whole thing. 2 countries with a Mediterranean coastline that also border France. The only way you could have gone wrong is if you didn't mention a place with a Mediterranean coastline. Most people got both of those right. You just needed to have written 2 country names. So for question 2, you're again supposed to use figure 1. You would have needed to have a read through and have a look at the pictures. The command word here is suggest, which means you need to pick out and explain. So it's 4 marks, which means you need to have done that twice. So you need to, the thing that most people struggled with was why. So you need to say why people are attracted as visitors to southern France. So things that you could have used were to do with days of sun, you could have done beaches. So you would have needed to have said that in figure 1 there are 300 days of sunshine, which lots of you did, but then to get the next mark you would have needed to have said why that attracts people. So it could attract people because they might like to sunbathe, or they might be able to go and do water sports because there's access to outdoor facilities. Okay, so with any suggest question, anything of 4 or 6 marks or up to 8 marks, it's going to be divided up into categories. You would have needed to have done a basic or a clear response. Your basic response would have just been a general description of what the south of France offers. To get into the clear response, you would have had to have offered some reason why whatever you said the south of France has helps to attract people. The nice thing about this is that it gives you an example of how of how the examiner might like it to be written. So your third question is the command word here is that you need to explain. So if you've been asked to explain, you need to be using point, evidence, explain, link. The example for the clear response gives you a good idea of what how you go about doing that. You definitely need to use figure 1. You also need to use your own knowledge. Your own knowledge can come in the form of key terms, or it can come in the form of an example. And you are encouraged to use examples, even if it doesn't say you definitely need to. So the way I go about doing this is I would start off with something to do with figure 1, and my first sentence would be in figure 1, and then I'd say something that could harm the environment in figure 1. A lot of you talked about overcrowding, but you didn't make it clear why overcrowding would cause environmental problems. I would then like you to use an example. The example that they use in the mark scheme is Dubai, and you used Dubai. Personally, I would prefer you to use somewhere like Southampton. The really good example that you could use in Southampton is the fact that there's an oil refinery and there's ships going in and out all of the time. You can talk about oil spills. However, you then need to explain how oil spills can affect the environment, how they can harm the environment, and that might be to damage habitats, or it could be a threat to wildlife if there's an oil spill. Okay, so again, you've been asked in this one to explain. If you're asked to explain, you need to be trying to use your peel structure. You need to talk about your physical processes. So the physical processes that you want to talk about here are abrasion, attrition, and hydraulic action. Lots and lots of you used those as kind of name dropping as you went through, but you didn't explain how it led to the sequence of each of these features forming. And that's the important thing. The mark scheme gives you a really good example in the detailed section of how that should be done. A lot of you fell into the middle ground kind of 3-4 because you were able to say the correct sequence. You were then able to apply either abrasion, attrition, or hydraulic action, and you could have talked about weathering as well, but you weren't able to explain how they caused those features to develop. So a lot of you said, or a few of you said before the start of the exam that you were going to struggle with math skills. In order to get marks in the math skills section, you really need to be able to use 6-figure grid references, and in this case they've asked you to measure distance. Distance is really quite an easy one to measure. You need to have a look at the scale. They are welcome to give you a 1 to 50,000 scale if you like. Most of the time it will be 1 to 25,000. What that means is that you get your ruler out, You measure the distance from one place to the other, and then you divide the number of centimetres by 4. Because on a 1 to 25,000 map, 1 kilometre equals 4 centimetres. If it was 1 to 50,000, the 1 centimetre 2 centimetres equals 1 kilometre. In this case, the answer was 2. If you put anything other than 2. And the thing that people struggled with was that they didn't read that it was to the nearest kilometre. So some of you tried to be smart and go, oh, I'll make it 2.16 kilometres. That was anything other than 2 is wrong. So for the next one, they give you a grid square. They ask you to say what the hard engineering techniques are that are in there. It says it. So if you said anything other than groins, you would have got the answer wrong. Okay, so for the next question, they asked you to use evidence from the Ordnance Survey map, and what a lot of you did really well was to use the symbols. You actually named the symbols. Some of you used 4 or 6 figure grid references, which I think is a really good thing for you to do. In order to get all of the marks, you don't need to have done that. They don't ask you to have done that necessarily. The key thing that you need to focus on here, again, is how. So you do know about how the environment provides a habitat for wildlife. We've looked at things like salt marshes, but you need to, rather than just mentioning that that's happening, you need to say how. So the example that it gives is that there are barns that provide shelter, and they provide the how is it provides shelter for nesting birds. So some of you might have said that it provides shelter, but you've not actually explained how it does it. So for question 1D, the command word is to suggest. You've been asked to look at 2 reasons, and the key word that you need to focus on for you guys is why. So you need to say why. Some coastlines need to be protected from the effects of natural processes. So you need to say, where is this number 1? You need to say something that's good about the coast, and then if it's not protected, what could the problem be? So for here, it says if the coast loses its beach, so that's one of the things that needs protecting, then it will no longer attract tourists. You have any of these things that you can choose from to say why there might be problems. So it is really, really broad, but you need to see it as 2 points. So you need to say one thing to do with what some coasts need, and then why that will be a problem if they're not protected. So 1E is an 8-mark question. It means that you need to be writing a minimum of 2 paragraphs. It gives you some extra space, and in the examiner's report it suggests that if you're given extra space, they would like you to try and use it. Most people will do better, as far as the examiner is concerned, most people will do better if they go into that extra space. That doesn't mean just make your handwriting a little bit bigger, but it kind of gives you an idea of the amount of detail you need to write it. I would suggest that you divide your paragraphs up by leaving a line, making 2 clear points. In this case, what they've asked you to do, your command word is to explain. And again, the key word there is to explain how soft engineering reduces the risk of flooding. And that's the difficult part. So reduces the risk of flooding in an area. You do need to use an example. The things that most of you did were you just talked quite a lot about what soft engineering is, which would have entitled you to a maximum, I would have thought, of no more than 3. You might have got 4 if you did it really, really well. Some of you would have talked about Pevensey Bay, beach recycling, beach replenishment, and beach reprofiling, beach recycling, and replenishment. Excellent. The one I would prefer you to talk about, because it's to do with reducing the risk of flooding, would be Wallasey Wetlands Creation Scheme and Managed Retreat. So you don't need to say, what the key thing here is, it's talking about soft engineering. You do not need to say how it's going to stop flooding. It's how are they going to manage the risk of flooding, and the way that Managed Retreat manages the risk of flooding is to, one, make it a little bit cheaper because they don't have to maintain all of the seawalls that were there, but they move important, highly valuable economic parts of the community away from areas at risk. The one that we looked at for the example that it gives in the book is talking about houses. So you can move houses away, you can move shops away, and make it a little bit safer. So you can use the example just there. That is one that they would suggest would get you full marks and would be a level 3 example. But they have used Pevensey Bay already. The thing with the example is that that doesn't use a load of data. So if you're thinking that you need to remember all of the numbers that we learned about, that's not necessarily the case. You don't need to do that, but you do need to be specific about the information that you choose. What they've done is they've chosen a specific place. What they've done really well is, because they've realised that you need to use an example, the very first thing that they say is the example that they studied. And I think that's a really good way of making sure that you tick the "I've used an example" box in the examiner's mind. If this had a figure, another good way of doing that to make sure that you clearly use the figure would be to start with "in figure 1" or "in figure 2", whatever that figure is. Okay, so in this case, again, you need to explain. You need to use point evidence explain to do it. It's a 6-mark question. Again, I'd suggest that you make sure that you write 2 well-written peel paragraphs about something that can be done to manage the coastline to reduce the pressure. You can use the example, but you need to make sure that you don't just copy information from it and leave it at that. My suggestion would be to use either the blue plan and talk about how the Mediterranean is managed to reduce pollution. You can talk about shoreline management plans and say how they may be. It could be to do with economic development, it could be to do with how they help with economic development, it could be to do with how they might help to reduce pollution and make the area a little bit safer. But anything to do with how they reduce pressure in coastal areas. You are allowed, if you've gone on holiday somewhere, you are allowed to use examples. So if you've gone somewhere where it's talking about, let's say you've gone to the south of France and you've seen that there is a specific location, let's say you went to Nice, and on the beaches around Nice, they've got signs up saying that they're going to fine people for littering on the beach, or they're not allowing dog walkers on the beach. Those are appropriate examples to use, as long as you explain how that method of coastal management is helping to reduce pressure. Important things that you need to pay attention to are figure 4. So I would do 1 paragraph starting with, in figure 4, a method of managing the coastal area to reduce pressure is, and then you go on to explain it. So I think that they talked about cycle paths and trying to reduce the amount of cars and therefore the amount of pollution. In your own knowledge, the examples I've talked about already, my preference would probably be, I would probably go with somewhere like St. Lucia and the Sucrier Marine Management Area, but you'd be more than welcome to talk about the Blue Plan or the way that DEFRA manage the whole of the UK. So the first thing that you get on the urban section is a graph. If you've not got anything drawn on the graph, if you've not tried to measure anything, if you've not drawn lines across, so going from the areas that are at the top, going from the minimum there, so that you can work out difference. If you've not tried in some way, shape or form to write on it to work out average, then I think that you would have missed a trick in some way, shape or form. The first one asks you to look at which part of the world it has the highest, is expected to have the highest percentage of population living in urban areas. There is only one answer to that. You've got North America, and then the second one, you can only have Africa. If you wrote anything else, you would have got no marks. I think most of you ended up with both of those. Again, the start of each section usually starts with something quite simple. Sometimes this will be missing a column, and the only thing that they'll ask you to do on that page is to complete the graph with the piece of information. Now, it may not be entirely clear that that's what the question is, and it's quite easy to miss 2 marks by not finishing the graph because you've just missed it. On one of the exams 2 years ago, they asked people to complete a map and about 25% of the people just skipped over the full page from the map because they didn't realise there was a question there. You need to make sure that you have a look at what's on every... So on the second question, the only thing that people struggled with was that they didn't really understand what falling death rate means. Falling death rate means that there are fewer people dying. So the key word that you want to talk about is natural increase. So if there are fewer people dying and the same number of people being born, the population is going to grow through natural increase. So what they would suggest that you do is they would like you to use the graph. It gives you some data just here. Second mark is to use the data. So question 2b, it asks you to look at figure 6. It asks you to explain how the conditions in figure 6 might cause problems for people living in urban slums. I would make sure that you pick something out. You specifically refer to something in figure 6, but this gives you a nice opportunity to bring in one of your case studies. You'd be more than welcome to link it back to Darrowby. You'd be more than welcome to link back to... we looked at Kibera in when we were actually doing this. There was a big map of Africa in the textbook, and it looked at a number of different places, and it was to do with things like self-help schemes and how they get people out of these problems. You may have also done this when you were looking at water aid, because water aid do work here as well. What would we be looking for you to do? Why might it cause problems? You'd be looking at things like overpopulation, causing it and making things unsafe for people to live in. Try and refer back to something that you can see there. You might want to talk about things like services not being available to people, so there may be the proliferation of diseases. So the diseases you'd be looking at largely would be waterborne diseases like cholera, typhoid, diphtheria. You'd be welcome to talk about Darrowby here and talk about 2,000 cases of waterborne diseases that are treated every day. You need to try and remember that you need to explain. So that's all you need to make sure you do. Where is the... It's still recording. So for that one, this gives you a really good example of what you might actually want to write. The wording here is often that they often use is you need to show some idea of cause and effect. So this is something that's happening, and because of that, this is something that's affecting the people in this area. You need to try and refer back to something you've seen in figure 6. 2b2. Key thing that people missed out here was that they didn't understand what the command word suggest meant. So again, you need to make sure that you pick something out and you give some sort of explanation. The mark scheme gives you a really good idea about what you need to do with this. So what do urban areas do to provide opportunities for poorer people? They provide education, and if they provide education, to get the next mark, if they provide education, that will help people to get better jobs. It's something really, really simple like that. So there might be an opportunity to get homes, which might give them better access to facilities like hospitals and other job opportunities perhaps. Okay, so you need to, in 2b3, you need to explain how improving water supply and sanitation in urban areas has increased the quality of life. You need to give an example. We did 2 examples. You'd be welcome to talk about one of the things you learned about called water aid. Now, water aid is one that isn't in the textbook, but we did need to teach about it, and we went to the computer room to have a look. You were given the option of either looking at how water aid work in Uganda or how they work in Kibera, which is a slum in Kenya. Often what they do is that they try to put water pumps in to make safe water accessible to people. The more specific example that we did was to look at Darrowby. And in Darrowby, even though it is in a legal settlement, it's a slum, between the hours of 5 and 7 in the morning, they have clean water piped into Darrowby, which people can fill up containers with safe water so that they don't get things like diphtheria, cholera, typhoid. And there are lots of statistics in your revision guide that would help you to add a little bit of bulk to that answer. You then need to explain how that would actually help them. So if they're there, if because of that sanitation system they're not drinking dirty water and they're not ill, it would make them more productive. And if they're more productive, they're more likely to make more money and therefore enable themselves to work their way out of living in the slum conditions that they're in. So in order to get both of the marks, you need to write you need to see that this is a suggest question, so you need to pick something out and then give an explanation for why that's helping in some way, shape or form. So in this case they're asking why congestion charging might, in the first one, reduce air pollution. So what it's doing is it's disincentivizing or it's discouraging people from using their cars, so it reduces the number of cars on the road. You then need to say how that would help to reduce air pollution. It helps to reduce air pollution by reducing the amount of emissions that those cars would pollute, and it might help people might push people towards public transport. For the second one, how would it reduce business costs? If there are fewer cars on the road, they're going to be going, the cars that are using the road, so if you imagine a delivery van is able to get through London much quicker, it means that it's going to be able to deliver much faster. It means that the costs aren't going to be quite as high in terms of the amount of petrol that they're going to be using, and they're going to be able to deliver more packages, so they're going to be able to make more money per package. This is the one that I felt most of you could have done a lot better than you did. So you need to use an example that you've studied other than congestion charging, and you need to use Peel because you've been asked to explain. You need 2 Peel paragraphs, and you need to say how traffic problems are managed in any way, shape or form. The example even goes so far as to give you Oxford, so if you have your own example, one that we didn't study necessarily, you're more than welcome to use that, and I would suggest that that's probably going to be something that you've done. Oxford Park and Ride is a way of managing congestion, and you're more than welcome to suggest that that's the case. Using trains, if you can talk about the train and an increased train service from Banbury to Oxford, that is a way of managing the traffic problem, managing congestion. What we looked at were Curitiba, and in Curitiba they have their triple articulated buses, and what triple articulated means is they are those three buses attached to each other, and in America they call, and here we call them bendy buses. It means that they can take lots and lots of people, I believe up to about 200 people. At peak times they're transporting around, I think it's 1.2 million people around Curitiba. They have three-lane arterial roads. What that means is they are the big main roads going in and out of the city in Curitiba in Brazil. And what that means is that they can have that designated middle lane for buses to get up and down. It makes it more efficient for people to get on a bus and get into town to get to their job than it would be for them to drive. What that means is that it's making people use one vehicle rather than lots and lots of vehicles to get to the same place. You then need to explain how that manages traffic problems. You would also be entitled to use, we did the Cambridgeshire Guided Busway, you'd be more than welcome to use that. We also did Manchester Metrolink, you'd be more than welcome to use that as well. If you have done other things, so for even things like the Barclays bikes that you find around London, if people are going to use those to stop, instead of using their car, then you're more than welcome to use those as well. In the news, one of the things that I tweeted about was Uber is considering itself as one of these because they now have they encourage ride sharing. Right, socioeconomic inequality. This is the first time this has come up. Usually what comes up as a definition question is define urbanisation, 2 marks. You need to say that the proportion of people going from rural areas into urban areas has increased. This is the first time that socioeconomic inequality has come up. We have studied socio-economic inequality, but at no point have we actually asked you, or been asked by the exam board to define that key term. It gives you an idea of what they're looking for, and you need to just say any of those two things. In some way, shape or form, what they're looking for is the difference between people based on what they have access to and the amount of money that they have in either an area or between countries. And what we often do when we're trying to figure out how to allocate funds around the country, we will look at socio-economic grouping, and that will be to do with, there are lots of factors that contribute to that, but largely it's to do with what kind of jobs people have, how much money they make, how close they are to facilities, do they have high aspirations in terms of their education, do they get certain number of A star to C's, certain percentage of A stars to C's, are crime rates low? So that would be how they talk about socio-economic inequality. So we studied socio-economic inequality when we looked at the Nightingale estate. You'd be also welcome to talk about socio-economic inequality when we did the redevelopment of Brindley Place. So here you need to suggest. That means, again, you need to pick something out, you need to explain, you need to do that twice in order to get your 4 marks. You need to talk about socio-economic inequalities. That means, in some way, shape or form, you need to talk about the difference between rich and poor areas. This is a good opportunity to use the word deprivation. For you guys, I would suggest that you use the example of the Nightingale estate in Hackney, London, and that's the one that we studied. The key thing here, which most of you struggled with, was that you talked about less developed countries, and you tried, because that was where you, for some reason, thought that socio-economic inequality may exist more. This asks for developed countries, so it needs to be in a country like the UK. What are you looking for here? So they're looking for you to suggest some way of improving education. So this gives, you might say something like giving places better facilities may improve education because it might encourage people to go to school and value school in a more in a better way, I suppose. Okay, so this would be this is always the way that the last question in the exam comes. They would give you some sort of picture or case study profile, and they'd ask you to explain something. Previously, it's to do with sustainability, and often it's to do with sustainability. They have never done about eco-towns, which is something that could come up, which I would suggest might come up. This is one of the ones to do with urban greening. The examples of urban greening we looked at were the New York High Line and the Kallang Basin in Singapore. And the Kallang Basin in Singapore is where they took away all of the pollution from the port, and they made it into a really nice park for people to use for recreation. And when we did that in the lesson, I showed you a video of a politician style person with a t-shirt on going around trying to help people, but essentially all he did was shake hands with people. That was all he did. I also showed you a video of the New York High Line. You'd be welcome to talk about what the New York High Line is. But again, the thing that people would have done most often was they would have gone, here, have a load of information about the New York High Line. This is what the New York High Line is. But you wouldn't have explained how greening the area would improve quality of life. So quality of life is to do with how does it help people to make more money? How does it help to improve their education? How does it help to reduce crime? How does it help to improve health? Now, the main thing that the New York High Line does is it encourages people in New York to walk further than they would have walked before. So the average person per day walks fewer than 5 blocks in New York. The New York High Line is longer than 10 blocks, and it encourages them to get more exercise, therefore reducing pressure on health services. You would need to make, because it's a 6-mark question and it's explained, you would need to make 2 points about either the New York High Line, which would be good because the New York High Line is pictured in that one there. Sorry, in that one there. So that's the New York High Line. This suggests that you might get away with talking about BedZ or the greenhouse. The thing that you need to focus on is the greening aspect of it. So what is going on in those places that would help to make the area a little bit greener and therefore improve quality of life. I'm going to put the mark scheme back up just for a couple of seconds. So again, divided up into two sections. So basic and clear. They would take an overall response of what you had written, and they would start to think, right, is this a clear response? Have they understood why you might do why urban greening might happen, and how it would help to improve quality of life? If you had just told me about an example that you knew about for urban greening, that would get you into level 1. And I think that was what most of you would have done.